What the 2022 American elections were really about is a check mark for American sanity. I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. Is it was determined that people want free, fair, judicious, honest elections.
When earlier this week, a very large exchange called FTX went bankrupt. They declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and they had over $10 billion of investors' assets on the exchange. It's the Lehman moment of crypto.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. This week, the collapsed crypto exchange FTX and its related businesses could owe money to more than 1 million people and organizations. That's according to documents filed in bankruptcy court on Monday. And it illustrates a corporate meltdown that has drained traders' accounts and plunged the crypto industry into crisis. We will talk to London crypto investment firm Nickel Digital about how all this happened and how regulators need to step in. But first, American democracy has been in peril since the Trump presidency. He unleashed huge political divisions and even violence, anything to hold on to power no matter the cost. Well, this week, Trump announced he'll try to make a run for the White House again. All right, let's talk U.S. politics. Reena Ninan is a friend, colleague, and she's a well-known journalist in America. She's been on ABC, CBS, Fox News, almost as many platforms as I've worked on, Reena.
You're making me sound so old, like I've been around too long.
Well, you went very quickly from one to another. No, you don't want to say that either, right? You better be careful. So this week, let's talk about, Trump has announced he's coming back. And I was astounded by the New York Post running this announcement at the bottom of the front page, and it says Florida man makes announcement, was the headline running across the bottom of the page in Wednesday's edition, directing readers to an article on page 26.
26.
What is that all about?
Wow. I think it's about much of America, and many Republicans are over Trump. His own daughter, I think, is over his political run. Ivanka Trump coming out saying she loves and will continue to support her dad, but she's not going to be active on this campaign. And I think that says everything. It says everything. And I think the repudiation from Republicans, what the 2022 American elections were really about is a check mark for American sanity. I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. Is it was determined that people want free, fair, judicious, honest elections, and they weren't willing to back these election deniers. I mean, some of them did get a couple seats, but overwhelmingly, that was the resounding walk away from 2022. Is people don't want that, and Republicans don't want that. And typically, when there is a president who's running in their first midterms, it's usually about that president and about its policies. But in this case, it was about Biden, who actually has very low approval ratings, and also about Trump. And that's what we saw.
Well, if you're right, and I have no reason to think that you wouldn't be, of course, that would be a huge breath of fresh air. But, there was a great post on Twitter. Florida man claims he only drinks at stoplights while not driving. Florida man sent back to prison after not paying for taxi ride home from prison. Florida man arrested for tossing gator into Wendy's. Someday Trump will be the king of Florida men. So that's where this Florida man thing comes from. But it's more important than that. I mean, the New York Post is owned by Rupert Murdoch, right? So it's by no accident the placement of that story on page 26. And it tells you what about Murdoch, who owns, among other things, Fox News, and what does it sounds like, the marriage is broken.
Well, this was also a marriage that he didn't want to really enter into. If you remember back when Trump had sort of, I believe it was Ivanka Trump, had kind of reached out back channeling to Rupert. And I don't think he really took Trump seriously. Nobody took Trump seriously until he really got the traction. I don't know if Trump even, honestly, if you were to ask him if he really took himself seriously, that he would make it as far as he did. And so in the beginning, Rupert really did not think that he had a chance and that this was really viable or somebody to support. And then the traction started building. We can discuss why he got the traction and how, but at this point, I think when that headline came out about Florida man, as Trump announced, remember, they saw the election results. They saw what came down and they read the room. And a lot of people found that incredibly funny.
The room where he made his speech, I think people were yawning, right? And nobody seemed more bored of the announcement than Trump himself. I mean, is his heart in this, do you think, or is he doing it for what reason?
A lot of people advised him, from what I've heard, not to announce when he did, that it just wasn't the right moment or the right time. And, Trump listens to Trump, and he felt he made this announcement. He was going to make this big reveal that everyone knew it was going to be him announcing his candidacy. It'll be interesting to see what happens more and more. I think everyone is watching Governor DeSantis, and he did incredibly well, not just winning the governorship, but by a significant lead, and more so than he did in his last election. I think that's very telling. And also keep in mind, they had a massive hurricane down in South Florida recently. And in general, governors of Florida, whether Republican or Democrat, tend to do really well and see a bounce that preceding election, no matter how the hurricane is handled, because it gives them a lot of airtime. They're doing live press conferences. They're talking about the aid they're getting. They're talking about how they're dealing with Washington. And I can't help but think that also plays into it.
That is such interesting perspective. I had no idea they're rubbing their hands together when they see a hurricane coming.
That's what happens. That's how people sort of tend to translate it. And you end up getting funds, emergency funds, and they are seen in a more compassionate way and as being action oriented. So typically they do enjoy a bounce after a hurricane.
And Trump and DeSantis seem to hate each other.
They absolutely. I mean, I think DeSantis has known to not be so isolating, but Trump has made it very clear where he stands on DeSantis.
Did you watch some of the interviews with Mike Pence, the former vice president, talking about maybe he's going to run, maybe he's not going to run, but he was pointedly asked about Trump, and he said, "I think we can do better."
Yeah. And I think that's what you're seeing within the Republican Party. It was for so long establishment Republican and then MAGA supporters. And I think that influence of MAGA supporters is waning. And where does that go? And to see someone like Pence, especially after the election, it was pretty smart for him to do an interview on CNN, like that type of town hall one-on-one format where you see him like this. And after he saw those election results, I'm not surprised that he chose to isolate himself.
So you're saying part of the vote in the midterms was a rejection of Trump's politics, and that the nasty, vitriolic America and the divided America that he created. I know I'm putting words in your mouth here, but that's really my take on it. But and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But what else was at play in the midterms as well? I mean, there was abortion, women's rights. There was a lot going on there. Trump was kind of in the caboose of the train, wasn't he?
I think we're still piecing together what 2022 means and the different data points. But the big overarching thing, a lot of times my struggle with Washington journalism, and I covered the Obama administration for ABC and spent a lot of time in Washington covering the George W. Bush administration for Fox News. And I have to tell you, a lot of times reporters get caught up in these insider stories that are just not relevant or just don't relate to the Midwest or the South or other parts of America. And the January 6th Commission, a lot of focus was on that. One, because it just was so incredible what had happened. A lot of these journalists faced the threats. They were on Capitol Hill. They know what it was like. But did that story resonate beyond Washington? Did people really understand the magnitude? And I think this election helped to prove that some people kind of understood what was at stake. But I think you can't dismiss abortion and what had happened. The demographic that I find most interesting and the data points that I'm trying to unearth is Generation Z, because they typically, when you look at polling and you look at sort of voters who are likely to turn out, they make up about 10%. But overwhelmingly, they came out, and 86% of Generation Z polled said that abortion was a big concern for them and that they did believe in abortion rights as well. So, and also for women, it's hard, even Republican women, it's hard to be able to say, yes, this was the deciding issue. This is what absolutely brought people in. But there's no question, I think, January 6th and the restriction of abortion access had an impact on voters.
So to tie that up for me on January the 6th, you do believe then that while a lot of people maybe didn't sit there and watch all those hearings, although, I think they were pretty amazing how they were put together and how they were choreographed. And it was pretty disturbing to watch some of the detail that we all thought we knew, and actually to see it all put together, I think was a huge, was it a wake-up call? I mean, it was certainly, made you understand how close democracy came to completely being crashed on the rocks in America. But you think that did play into the election, or that people, in the end, it wasn't the main issues when they went out to vote?
I think the issues always matter. I think the economy, no question about it, is front and center. It was one of the top issues, and then also security. That was another issue. But there's no question the way the January 6th situation was presented, the follow-up from Capitol Hill, Liz Cheney, Congresswoman Liz Cheney, having her come forward and just so strongly stand out against Trump and against what had happened. And remember, people who know the Cheneys will tell you they find Liz Cheney more conservative than her father on certain issues, like abortion. She doesn't believe in a woman's right to choose. Not that Dick Cheney necessarily does, but I think that on a lot of more issues, she's conservative. But on this, the issue of democracy, she was really tough and stood very tall in standing up against Trump and MAGA supporters on this, and really wanted to unearth the truth, and did.
So I want to think that, this nice thought that the midterms take us back to some kind of normalcy of politics in America, and people just went out and vote, and the results in the end brought us the winners, however slim some of those results were, and some of them are really thin, right? Mm-hmm. But the Democratic Governor Whitmore, she's in Michigan, right?
Yes.
She's she ran against an election denier, and she was a potential victim of extremism, right? I mean, there was a plot to kill her.
There was an assassination plot. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And I got to tell you, it's so funny. Yeah.
So she's come out now and said the biggest threat of terrorism is coming from inside the United States, and that it's quote unquote, a scary prospect, what may still happen. So this didn't go away with the midterms.
And also, you got to keep in mind, yes, she faced this attempted assassination attempt that was really intricate and unbelievable. But she also took very decisive action against Roe v. Wade. And I think that won her points, something like 29 points ahead by Generation Z, who chose to come out and vote for her. Interesting, Megan Whitmer is also very active. Her and Fetterman, who both of these two, Fetterman out in Pennsylvania, who beat Dr. Oz, both of them are very active on Twitter and TikTok. And I think that they're enjoying a bounce from Generation Z from that as well. But they really use those two platforms to reach that audience as well. But I think she is one person, Dana. I would say there's a lot of questions. I don't know if we want to get into this, of whether or not Biden and Kamala Harris should run as the ticket for 2024.
I'm happy to get into it. I mean, Biden's getting pretty tired looking.
And it's interesting, though, you look at it, and he was still able to galvanize and mobilize voters to come out early and on election day, and a younger
with the help of President Obama, ex-President Obama, right?
Obama was hugely influential. I think you can't discredit that. He went to some of these hugely competitive races where we didn't really know what would happen, and there's no question his influence did have an impact there. But Gretchen Whitmer is one woman to watch in American politics. I am curious if she will throw her hat in the ring. If Biden chooses to remain, does Kamala Harris stay on that ticket? Do they find somebody else?
If Biden stays,
yeah,
in the U.S. system, there's no contest, right? He's not challenged, is he?
He can be challenged. Somebody can, but in modern history, it really hasn't happened. And And it's also messy because you really want a party united saying this is our candidate? It's not really great messaging saying, and then the people who felt left behind,
Yeah. So the last thing I just want to touch on with you, and I appreciate your time, is that how does this now play out between the House being controlled by the Republicans? The Senate looks like, I understand there's a runoff in Georgia, but it looks like the Senate, even with the tiebreaker by the vice president, right, is under the control of the Democrats. How does that play out? Is that political meltdown, or is that some recipe for reconciliation between the two parties in a way, because they can't get anything done without each other?
The R word, reconciliation, I don't think ever really pops up anymore in Washington. They're so far apart. But it'll be interesting because when you look at kind of Obama's record and what he was able to achieve, there was a lot of there were a lot of policy issues. And if you look at, I'm just looking at kind of at Biden's record, he was able to get the COVID stimulus bill passed. There were when you look at Biden's record, he was really able to get a lot of these issues passed: the COVID stimulus bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the industrial policy stuff that was able to be pushed through. So there are substantive policies that he has managed in 2 years to get through that sometimes I don't think gets pushed out into the public as well. But ultimately, it will come down to whether he decides to run. And Republicans still have a little bit of a majority in the House, but I think they're going to have to work together on some of the issues. And the Senate is still Democratic, so we'll have to see what happens. One of the big misses, I think, for Democrats in this past 2 years of having the majority in the House and the Senate, when you talk about safeguarding democracy, which was one of the biggest concerns going into 2022, there wasn't a lot of action taken. I can't really point to much of anything that Democrats were able to enact and push forward that really could have, if these election deniers had won, how do you stop that? How do you prevent that from happening? So it'll be interesting to see what Democrats do. They still wield a lot of power, but also keep in mind, in about 6, 7, 8 months, we're already gearing up towards 2024. And then that race, a lot of it's just harder to get a lot of legislation through. So we'll have to see what happens. And then the economy. JP Morgan came out today saying that they believe it'll be a mild recession at the back end of 2023. I got to say, Dana, you follow the economy closely. You and I talk about this often. Who knows? But we just have no clue what's going to happen in the next 12 months. But over and over again,
the Ukraine war, mix in inflation. I mean, here in the UK, they're saying that the economy is flatlining. That's not a good way to describe your economy, right?
No,
but
no.
I mean, everybody relies on the U.S. economy to stimulate the world as well.
That's right. No, it's a big thing. And also for American voters, their pocketbooks are definitely number one issue for everyone. And everyone, I do get the sense, higher energy costs, Europe facing much higher than in the US. Mm-hmm. I think everybody wants to make sure that the American economy is on track and we're doing the right things.
Let's end where we began. What is Reena's prediction for Donald Trump?
And is absolutely unpredictable. But based on momentum, I just see this puttering out. I really, even if he goes, I just don't see that he has the base he once had and enjoyed in back when he first ran. And I think Republicans are trying to figure out how to get the next round right. And
how quickly, by the way, does that happen? Does that has to happen soon? Does it? Because they've got to sort that out in the next year, or how quickly does it happen?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I really don't know exactly how much time both parties really have. I
guess it depends on whether there's challengers, how many of them are, and then how that plays out, right?
Yeah, and I think about, going way back, my first American politics memory back in 1992 with Bill Clinton running against George H.W. Bush, governor of Arkansas, kind of coming out as the dark horse. A lot of times in our memory, a lot of these candidates come out as dark horses and end up winning. I think in America, people love a good, so we'll have to see who gets fielded in both parties. It'll be interesting for sure.
Reena Ninan, great to talk to you. Great to interview you and have you on the podcast. Backstory. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here. I'm a huge fan of the podcast, Dana. You've got some great guests coming on every week. I enjoy listening.
Thank you, Reena. All right, Michael Hall is with Nickel Digital, and they are managers of cryptocurrency investments in London. Hi, Michael, and thanks for joining us today to talk about what has been a momentous couple of weeks in cryptocurrency, right?
Good morning, Dana. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, look, I don't think anybody would fault me for describing this as an earthquake in crypto markets. What started it all?
This was really started by, we have to go back in time 3 months to the lunar terror crisis, which precipitated a series of bankruptcies, first of 3 Arrows Capital, then of some lenders, and it left bad assets on people's books. And finally, the chickens came home to roost when earlier this week, a very large exchange called FTX went bankrupt. They declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and they had over $10 billion of investors' assets on the exchange. It's the Lehman moment of crypto. The good news is no taxpayer money will be used in this bailout. There's no Fed. The Fed sent $85 billion to AIG Financial Products in 2008. That's not going to happen here. It's going to get resolved and worked out by adults without any regulators involved.
But the bad news is people lost money. So regulators or no regulators, people lost a lot of money. I mean, it's several $1 billion probably for investors.
Yes, and it's not just institutional investors such as ourselves. I mean, we got our hair mussed. We lost 4% in our arbitrage fund, 9% in a multi-strategy fund. Another fund we had insurance, so let's see if that pays out. So we weren't hit badly, but we were hit. We haven't been caught by anything else, but this caught us out because it's such an unusual story. In fact, as context, there will be books written about this, and we know there is because Michael Lewis, the author of Liar's Poker, was shadowing the main character in this story for the last 6 months with the idea of writing a book. I now imagine he's very hurriedly re-editing the book.
He's got a profitable one, whereas the guy he was following is broke. So for people that don't know cryptocurrency at all or digital currencies, what is an FTX trading platform? That's where you went to trade your digital currencies?
Yes, it's a digital exchange. It's an offshore digital exchange. And it was offshore because it traded derivatives, and derivatives exchanges haven't yet been approved by the regulators, not in the US, not in Europe. And so these exchanges that members of the public want to trade on, and institutions like us want to trade on, they are forced to establish themselves offshore. FTX was headquartered in Antigua, and I think they were physically present in the Bahamas. So that's where they were. And there are other exchanges like them in offshore places as well, like Seychelles, Singapore, Gibraltar, Hong Kong. They've all been forced offshore by the lack of regulation, the lack of clarity of rules around derivative exchanges.
That seems opposite to me. You'd think that if there was a lot of regulation onshore, that would be the reason they went offshore. I don't understand. Why do they need to be offshore?
Because they're just not approved to do what they do. It's a very interesting play. If you allow me for a second to go through the cast of characters, you have the main villain, Sam Bankman-Fried. He, MIT physics grad, worked at Jane Street, the storied proprietary trading firm, then left to set up Alameda Capital, a proprietary trading firm that he ran, and then set up FTX. And these two companies, Alameda Capital and FTX, were together entwined, and a lot of the money that was lost from FTX was lost by Alameda Capital. It's notable that Sam Bankman-Fried, his parents are two Stanford law professors. They are big Democratic fundraisers, and Sam himself gave $40 million to the Democrats, which may explain some of his close relationship with US regulators. He's gone to Capitol Hill. He's testified in front of Congress. He's met with Gary Gensler, the head of the SEC, and the head of the CFTC as well. In fact, his girlfriend, who runs Alameda Prop, her father is the head of the economics department at MIT, who gave Gary Gensler his lecturing job there. So it's all very entwined. You couldn't make it up. Other characters include the investors, not just us, but there were people who invested in the equity of his exchange. Now, we may get some recovery on the money that we put on the exchange, but those investors in equity, they've been wiped out. Now, these are people like Temasek, the the multi-billion-dollar fund who spent 9 months doing due diligence on them and invested $200 million finally in them. In that fundraising round, which is a 32 billion fundraising round, included SoftBank. We see their name again, BlackRock, Ontario Teachers Pension Fund, and people like Paul Tudor Jones and Izzy Englander, the founder of the $50 billion Millennium Hedge Fund. They were also personally invested. So you'd think that people like that would do their due diligence on them, but clearly that wasn't. We're finding out now that it wasn't done. So, and then we have the promoters. I mean, these are people who were on the Super Bowl. So do you remember Larry David's Super Bowl ad for FTX?
Yes, there were a lot of celebrities that came forward with these ads saying that they were going to invest.
Tom Brady, Gisele Bündchen. Tom Brady's the American David Beckham, except he's
absolutely
he's much more talented and has a I guess a more attractive wife than Beckham does. But essentially, all these players were involved in this story that involved in $10 billion being stolen by FTX and moved to Alameda, where Alameda lost this money. And that money should never have been moved.
So it's really important what you're talking about, right? Because I'm an old crime reporter, and generally there is always a wall, if I can call it that, between one company and another. And if you have investor funds, you just can't move those over to another company without asking the investor to cover the debt. But I mean, that is essentially what happened, right? I mean, FTX moved money over to this other company.
Yes, apparently there was a backdoor written into the accounting system they used so that Sam Bankman-Fried could transfer money from the exchange into the accounts of Alameda Prop Trading Company. It's straight out criminal fraud.
Well, there's everybody's involved now. The SEC, the Justice Department, lots of people are investigating. But I didn't realize, I mean, are you victims yourselves in terms of some of your investor money was held there? You were trading?
Not only. So we had money of our own invested in our own funds. So we invest in our own funds. We've taken a 10% hit on the investment that we had in the multi-strategy fund. The investors in our arbitrage fund have taken a 4% hit on their investment. Now, for us, we think this is recoverable. We can make this money back. And one thing, if there is any good news in this, it's that there are far fewer people playing in this space now. This capital that's being taken out means that there'll be more opportunities and we'll be able to get more attractive returns for our investors. But that still doesn't make everybody whole. It's just the people who invest in funds now where there are far fewer people playing in this space. So the opportunities will be bigger and they'll persist for longer. So that's the only really good news.
And then I know something about your company. I mean, you guys come from banking backgrounds. You're not, long-haired t-shirt kids who are messing around with cryptocurrency. You all understand institutional investment, safeguards for holding people's assets. So I know you can't like any of this, but at the same time, Michael, where do you think now, when you talk about regulation and you talk about safeguards, what do you think now has to happen?
Well, I think the regulators have to get involved. When you have Super Bowl ads promoting an exchange, which then goes bust, losing $10 billion, there were US retail clients involved, even though they weren't supposed to be involved. I'm sure they were. Why does somebody advertise on the Super Bowl if they're not looking to attract US retail? So the US regulators have essentially dropped the ball on this one. And they should have, rather than say they just prohibit these exchanges, they need to say we need to work with them and get them onshore and then regulate them. But why
haven't they done that? I mean, they know that all the money's been attracted to cryptocurrency, digital currency? Why? They know the high profile part of this. They have been lobbied. The regulators have been lobbied to legalize funds and to accept trading of funds on the main exchanges. They've tried to avoid all of that. Why? What has brought us to this moment with the regulator?
Well, you really have to ask them that question. We can surmise and say that it's a lack of knowledge, a lack of education at the regulator. But we can only surmise. You really have to ask the regulator why. And the interesting thing is, of all the people, of all the exchanges who were engaging most with the regulator, Sam Bankman-Fried was the leader. He was the one going to Congress. He sat down with Gary Gensler. He sat down with the CFTC commissioners who were tweeting out pictures of themselves with him. And he comes across as a sociopath, because he was engaging with these people while he was committing this enormous fraud.
I mean, I want to say the answer is that the regulators just haven't liked cryptocurrencies, and for that reason,
it could be that too.
They've steered away from them, and now they've got billions in losses from investors who are going to say, "Step up and start regulating."
Exactly. But how do they do that? How does someone in the US regulate an exchange that's based in the Seychelles? People in America have access to VPNs. The way to do it is to bring it onshore.
And how would you bring it onshore? If you can just tell me in a simple way, you would make it attractive for them to be onshore, or you would mandate if you're taking money from America or you're taking money from Europe, you're going to have a company licensed onshore.
Okay, so there are two issues American regulators have with cryptocurrency exchanges, these derivative exchanges. One is CFDs. So CFDs, contracts for difference. They're very common in Europe and especially in London, but the US hasn't approved any of those. So the US just doesn't like CFDs. It's a type of contract. What about futures contracts and derivatives? They have those. Those exist on the CME in Chicago, and they could approve those and have those, but they haven't. They haven't given regulatory license. They've been aggressively going after people like Coinbase and Kraken for minor infractions while letting $10 billion float off to the Caribbean. And it's just wrong. But they need to wake up and smell the coffee.
Is some of this related to what's going on and I don't profess to understand fully what's going on in the tech industry right now, but Twitter, Meta, Amazon, huge layoffs. I mean, I think 35,000 people have been laid off in the last week or two. It's a huge tech dip, and dip may be an understatement.
Yeah, I don't think it's connected to that. This is just fraud. This is somebody who got in over their head, made some bad bets, tried to cover it up with investor money, and then blew up. And this is on a scale of Madoff. I mean, the net Madoff loss at the end was around $9 billion. The net between the money he actually took out and burnt and destroyed. There were a lot of recoveries from that Madoff money. I don't think we'll have as high recoveries here, but one can hope that the administrator does a good job and recovers as much money for the investors as possible. But I think that's unlikely because it was just burnt by Alameda in the markets. So that's unfortunately the situation.
Do you think that the money is going to come back to the crypto market after? I mean, people have been bruised.
Yeah, so we've seen about half of the volume that was on FTX migrate over to Binance, another unregulated offshore exchange. Now, this exchange, Binance, is run by a person called CZ. He's the main kind of shareholder and owner. But we can't be presuming that just because someone appears to be a benevolent leader that they're not going to do just what Sam Bankman-Fried has. It's not enough to have regulation after the fact and put people in jail. Investors need to be protected before then.
Michael Hall with Nickel Digital. Great to talk to you, Michael. Thanks so much.
Dana, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And that's our backstory this week. Thanks so much to journalist Reena Ninan on American democracy and on the crypto meltdown, Michael Hall. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.